Iansan will be out in a couple of days, and many players are very hyped for her, with some people even touting her as a meta-defining character who will be the second coming of Bennett. But can she really live up to such high expectations, or is she perhaps being overhyped? Her early access videos are up on bilibili, so her numbers and everything with her kit is now public, and in today's video, we'll be using this information to calculate and see how strong Iansan should actually be, for which teams, as well as her best builds and overall strength in the meta. Let's get started. Alright, so Iansan is a 4-star Electro support unit with a kit heavily focused on buffing attack, which is where all the comparisons to Bennett are coming from. Her attack buff is not as large as his, but she can also use 4-piece scroll and provide 25 damage bonus with her C6 as well, although a lot of units won't be able to benefit from the C6. If you can get the max value out of Iansan's buffs, she can provide more total buffing than Bennett, while not confining you to stay within a circle like he does. However, Iansan has basically the opposite condition of Bennett. You have to constantly be moving to sustain her Nightsoul points. If you are not, once her Nightsoul points go under 42, you'll lose a lot of the attack buff. You'll know if she is above or under 42 Nightsoul, because there will be an icon of her face if above, and it'll be her skull mask if below. Iansan also does not heal. Well, she does heal, but it's basically non-existent, so just pretend it's not there. And not healing can be a very big disadvantage compared to Bennett for team building. With all of that in mind, since being able to replace Bennett is something a lot of players are probably looking forward to, let's see which teams she should be able to do this in. First, we have Mavrika. She moves around a lot with her charged attack and even her burst animation as well, so she will effortlessly be able to maximize all of Iansan's buffs. The team already has Lali providing shielding, so losing Bennett's heal is not a big deal. However, Bennett's buffing is especially great for Pyro DPS, since they get Pyro Resonance and 15 damage bonus from his C6, so Bennett is slightly ahead of Iansan here, though it's close enough to where you probably won't notice a difference. Many players also already have a Constellated Bennett though, whereas you would have to pick up Iansan from scratch, which might not be the wisest use of your Primo Gems. However, what if we used 100% of the brain, and instead of replacing Bennett, we replaced Shilonin? Since both Iansan and Shilonin can use Scroll, the only actual buffing Shilonin uniquely provides here is 36% Rest Shred, and we already have 20% from Lali. So a C6 Iansan ends up buffing Mavrika by 18% more than a C0 Shilonin. However, it is not necessarily easier to get a C6 Iansan than a C2 Shilonin, especially with Shilonin having a banner in the same patch. If we instead compare a C2 Iansan to C0 Shilonin, Iansan is still about 9% ahead, but if you already have Shilonin's weapon, then she pulls ahead ever so slightly, and if Shilonin is C2 R1, she'll be about 4% stronger than Iansan. So how good Iansan is for your Mavrika really depends on how much investment you have, or will have, in your Shilonin. It's a large upgrade if you C6 Iansan and leave Shilonin at C0, but if you don't want the 5 stars on Iansan's banner, then you might be better off just investing more into Shilonin. But going back to Iansan versus Bennett, we also have Kinich. He moves around a lot during his field time, so we should also have no issues maintaining Iansan's buffs. If you could just replace Bennett with Iansan and be done and not need to change anyone else on the team, assuming that with Bennett you can't refresh scroll after the first rotation, then Iansan would be about a 13% upgrade to the overall team DPS. This is great, however, we now come back to the problem of Iansan's poor healing. The team has no sustain, so I can't in good faith recommend it. Thus, you'll likely need to use Toma instead of Mavrika or Pyro Traveler. Doing this, the team ends up with about the same DPS as using Mavrika and Bennett if you can't get Scroll after the first rotation with them, while also freeing up Kinich from Bennett's problematic circle impact, and you also have the comfort of a shield. So while Iansan won't be raising Kinich's ceiling unless you can play without sustain, she will be a very good practical upgrade for him. And once we eventually get a better off-build Pyro sustain unit other than Toma, it should be a ceiling raiser as well. But Mavrika and Kinich are the only characters Iansan seems capable of reasonably replacing Bennett at all. For everyone else, they either don't move enough for her buff, or Bennett provides additional utility that Iansan cannot make up for. But as we saw with Mavrika, Iansan can still be strong even if not replacing Bennett, So let's see what other teams can use her like this. Varessa is releasing alongside Iansan, and she will be best in slot in Varessa's strongest teams. I won't go over their synergy in too much detail here since I already did in my Varessa video. Check out that one for more information. But if you are going for Varessa, you'll get excellent value out of Iansan, even if you don't get her to C6. Shaska is another attack scaling Natlan DPS. She can maintain Iansan's buff if you just hold down your movement button while she loads up her bullets. This will be a pretty good upgrade over Auroran for the Overvape team. However, Chaska's best team will still be Melt with Mavwika, Seedlali, and Bennett. Mavwika's massive front-loaded AoE damage with her Melted Burst just helps with so many of Chaska's problems, it's way too good for her to be replaced. And you don't want to use Iansan over Bennett here in a melt, because now you have Electro Bullets messing up the reactions. So while Iansan can be used in a good team for Chaska with Overvape, I don't recommend it at all unless you do not wish to play Melt for whatever reason you may have. Then in that case, Overvape with Iansan is best. Moving on from Natlan DPS, Plunge DPS have a lot of movement, since it will count as movement both when you jump and also when you plunge down. So one non-Natlan DPS that should be able to maintain over 42 Nightsoul on Iansan is that boy Gaming. You won't be replacing Bennett here, since as mentioned with Mavwika, Bennett actually buffs more than Iansan for Pyro DPS, plus Gaming is burst reliant, so you need those extra particles. Thus, Iansan would have to replace Jian Yun here. For these numbers, I am assuming Gaming does not get the damage bonus from Iansan C6 due to having to cast both Bennett and Seedlali after Iansan. And with this assumption, a C6 Iansan is about the same DPS as a C0 Jian Yun, and Jian Yun is reliant on VV Reshret for a good portion of her value, so Iansan may feel better in multi-wave content. But Shenyun is not only running in the same pack as Yansan, but also on the same banner, so chances are you might end up with a C2 Shenyun trying to get Iansan, in which case Iansan cannot compare. So ultimately, it's hard to recommend Iansan for Gaming. It's going to depend on what you end up having on your account. Xiao is another plunge DPS that may be able to get value out of Iansan. Here, you would have to replace Farina since you'd have no healer if you replace Xian Yun. For these numbers, I am assuming that Xiao does not get Iansan's C6 buff due to his long burst animation, and that her attack buff runs out by the last two plunges. In this case, a C6 Iansan is about equal to a C0 Farina. You get a lot more personal damage on Xiao, but lose Farina's sub-DPS damage. If you don't get Iansan to C6 and have her at C2 instead, then she'll naturally be considerably worse than Farina. And since Farina is on her third banner right now, a lot of Xiao mains likely already have her at C1 or C2, in which case there would be no point in using Iansan unless you just want to use Farina on the other team. Plunge DPS aside, I have seen a lot of people expecting Iansan to be a big upgrade for Clorinde, but the thing with that is, in an overload team, Clorinde is already reaching the max attack for the buff from her passive, and that's where most of her scalings come from, so Iansan doesn't actually buff Clorinde by much more than Auroran. Both buff her scroll and provide 30% attack, while Auroran also deals good sub-DPS damage, and has shorter cooldowns that allow for 16-second rotations, though you do need to skip Mavrika's burst in the second rotation for that. Overall, Iansan and Auroran are basically the exact same DPS with Clorinde. If you don't have a constellated Auroran, you can pick up Iansan Constellations instead, so it is nice to have two great options for the second Electro here, rather than just one. But one more quick thing worth mentioning here is, the calc here has Auroran with an R1 Alley Hunter, but you might have a 5-star weapon for him like Polar Star for example, which will make him do a lot more damage, and the DPS will be higher with him than Iansan in that case, since giving Iansan a 5-star weapon won't actually change anything for her here. And those are the only characters I can imagine feasibly maintaining over 42 Nightsoul on Iansan, but if you can average around, say, 30-ish Nightsoul, she still provides a good amount of buffing, so she may be a good option for a couple of other characters as well. Arlecchino uses a good amount of dash cancels and can lunge forward with her N1, so this should be able to keep you at least 30 Nightsoul. If it does, then C6 Iansan is about the same strength as a C0 Shalon in here. And Arlecchino's son, Lenny, may also be able to use Iansan in a similar way. He can move while doing his charge shots, although slowly, and he can do dash cancels after each charge shot as well. So assuming he averages, say, 30 Nightsoul as well, C6 Iansan should be a bit stronger than C0 Shalonen. However, with Lenny and Arlecchino here, it's the same as with Mavrika. Chances are it would be better for your account to get C2 Shalonen rather than trying to get Iansan's Constellations, since Shalonen is in the same patch, and she will be quite a lot stronger than Iansan at that point. Additionally, enemies with high resistance are pretty common in the Abyss these days, and Shalonen is stronger than what spreadsheet calcs reflect against these enemies, since calcs assume that enemies have 10% resistance. Aside from that, the only other character I can imagine Iansan possibly working well with is Wanderer. He can slowly move around while attacking, and gets free dashes with his A4 passive, but it's hard to imagine how much Nightsoul he should be able to average, since he can take up to 2 full combos before he gets his first dash. Because of this, I won't show any calcs for it until I've tested this in post-release, but since Iansan can't buff Wanderer with Scroll, and he's definitely not getting her C6 buff, it's almost certainly not worth spending your primos on Iansan for him. She's at absolute best going to be a side grade to other options that you probably already have. I'd say wait to see what Aoife does. He has a much better chance of being an upgrade for Wanderer. But yeah, that covers all of the teams I believe Iansan should be good in, so let's now go over how to build her. Fortunately, Iansan is very simple to build. She doesn't do meaningful damage, so you can just focus on getting as much energy recharge and attack percent as possible to maximize her support. So for your main stats, you'll use either ER or Attack Sense, and then Attack Goblet and Circlet. If you are using Favonius, then you may want a Crit Circlet for consistency. Substats, just get as much ER and Attack as possible, with Crit Rate as well if using Favonius. And for the sets, you're almost always going to be using Scroll, but if somebody else on the team has it, or if using Iansan on a team that Scroll can't buff, such as Zhao, Noblesse is good. And for weapons, her best two will be Calamity Queller and Engulfing Lightning. Calamity provides a tremendous amount of attack, while Engulfing provides a ton of energy recharge plus a good amount of attack. Either one you have will work fantastic. If you don't have either, then the free weapon from the Inazuma event also gives a good amount of attack and energy recharge. Otherwise, use Favonius, which can be better in teams where the rest of the team will appreciate the lower ER requirements. As for how much ER you'll need on Iansan, assuming you have her C1, it shouldn't be any more than 180% at absolute worst, so with an energy weapon and good substats, you won't have any issues. Lastly, the one other thing to know with Iansan is how important her constellations are. The value of her constellations will vary from team to team. Using Mavrika team as an example, you can expect to get 20% extra damage on Mavrika from C0 to C6 Iansan. But in some teams, the value of each constellation will be different. For example, her C1 will be a lot more important in teams with high energy requirements on her. C4 is very hard to gauge the value of, should be a lot more valuable in teams with less movement, and C6 will be a lot more important in teams that need the extra buff uptime it provides. And that covers everything. So, what's the overall meta analysis on Iansan? I'd say she's definitely pretty overhyped. While she buffs by a lot in theory, her condition for the buffing is very restrictive. It makes her niche in what teams she can actually work well in. And even in the teams that she does work well in, she's usually competing for a slot with 5 stars like Shalonen, Farina, and Jianyun, whom are either on banner right now or will be in the same patch as her, so you might be better off just getting their constellations rather than trying to see 6 Iansan, especially if you don't want the 5 stars Iansan is rated up with. So Iansan's primary use cases will be as the best second Electro for Veressa, a practical upgrade for Kanich, and a Shalonen side grade for Mavrika. Therefore, I really don't think she's having this big impact on the meta that I have seen hyped up. That said, a character being overhyped does not mean they aren't good. Iansan is still looking to be very strong for a 4-star character, able to compete with some of the strongest supports in the game for a few different teams, freeing them up to be used on your other team, which can be very valuable. But I'm curious to know your thoughts, so please leave a comment letting me know down below. And if you enjoyed the video, please don't forget to like and subscribe if you haven't already. Thanks, and goodbye. I can't pretend my